Welcome back to Terms of Service. I'm Claire Duffy. I'm sure we've all wondered at some point, what would it be like to understand what animals are saying? It's the subject of countless movies and thought experiments, but thanks to artificial intelligence, we might be closer to that reality than ever. So where are we on this journey to communicating with animals, and what could it mean for how we interact with the world around us? To dig into all of this, I have Aza Raskin here with me. Aza is the co-founder of the Earth Species Project, a nonprofit that's using AI to decode animal communication. Hi, Aza.
Hey, Claire. Nice to be here.
Okay, so to get into it, if you could ask an animal a question, what animal and what question would it be?
Yeah. Well, actually, this is a perfect way in because almost always people want to start by saying, well, this is fundamentally about communicating with animals. This is about breaking the interspecies communication barrier. And actually, that's not how we're thinking about it at all. It's the other way around. It's how can we start breaking down the interspecies understanding barrier? How is it that we can better understand the other cultures and languages of Earth? And to even start with being like, well, what question should we ask them? Really, this is about what can we learn by listening? And, we've already discovered, science has already discovered, belugas have names they call each other by. So do dolphins. They talk about each other in the third person. So do elephants. And even parrot parents will spend the first couple of weeks of their child's life leaned over their chick, whispering a unique name, which that then chick will grow up and use for the rest of their life. And it's so surprising that actually most of humanity doesn't even realize that something as fundamental as identity is shared. And then think about whale and dolphin culture. They pass down culture from mother to child. They also have menopause, one of the few species that does like humans, which means they have a grandmother culture carrier role. And they've been passing down culture and dialect for like 30 million years, 34 million years, 85 times longer than the human species has existed. And just imagine what kind of wisdom they might have that is beyond the sphere of a human imagination.
Yeah, I love that. Just that shifting of the frame of reference from like us seeking something to us just listening and seeing what we can learn. Will you talk about some of the projects that you're working on right now and what you sort of expect the output of those projects to look like?
Yeah, I'll name two. One is we're just right now wrapping up some work with crows in Spain. Every time we do a project, generally we find one or a couple biology partners to work with. And they're actually out there in the field and we partner with them to figure out how we want to collect data. So in this study, the crows have little backpacks on that record not just audio, but how they move and motion. And you can hear them fly. You can hear when they return home. Our AI has discovered a call that the birds make specifically when they're on their way home to get their chicks ready for feeding. It turns out there are a lot of intimate calls, sort of very quiet calls that the birds make in close range, turns out often while flying. And that makes up something like, at least in our data sets, 70% of all communication appears to be these close, intimate calls. And the researchers we're working with looked at this and were like, we didn't know. We have to go investigate. And think about that. Crows are one of the smartest species on Earth. They have sort of the mental capacity of the great apes. Yet, most of their communication seems to have been missed because our tools weren't good enough. And imagine trying to understand the language of humans, but only by listening to our shouts.
Yeah.
Right? We would miss a lot. That's where we are with crows. So that's like one area I think is very interesting. The other area is that we're starting to work really deeply with orcas. And, orcas, one of the most intelligent species on Earth, incredible cultures. There's a fad that hit orca culture a couple of years ago where one orca started wearing a dead salmon as a hat.
Hats.
Exactly, which I'm hoping will make a comeback in humans. And so they have fashion fads. Like they're
Totally.
a very
well, and they
interesting
have
species.
Running into the boats of billionaires trends as well.
Exactly. Humans seem to always win. So I am all for orcas like gaining a victory. So the question in our minds is in the last 20 years, a lot has been learned about orcas, orca culture, their DNA, evolution, but almost no advancements have been made on understanding their communication because it's just too complex. And so as part of our work in pioneering sort of like animal language processing, sort of the equivalent of NLP, natural language processing in humans, that's the thing that powers ChatGPT. We're now building that for animals. We're trying to say, can we get a much deeper understanding? And so we're looking at drone footage paired with underwater audio. There are a decade plus worth of recordings of orca audio, but no video. So we don't really know what's going on. If we can reconstruct what was going on, suddenly it opens up a massive amount of data that lets us get much closer to decode much quicker.
And so in that case, in theory, you'd be saying, okay, when all the orcas moved over here, they made these sounds, or when they went to feed, they made these sounds, or when the mom reunites with the baby, and that's sort of you're pairing those behaviors with the sounds that you're hearing.
Exactly. Think about this for humans. Imagine you just had a lot of audio and a lot of video of humans, and you're trying to understand, what does this word lunch mean? And you'd say, well, let me look at all of the contexts in which lunch occurred. It always seems to start around 10 a.m. and go until a little afternoon. The prevalence of the word lunch gets more and more and more, and then everyone seems to migrate, and then they stop talking about lunch. Well, maybe it has something to do with that behavior, right? You can start to figure out what something means by looking at its context.
And how does AI approach trying to understand animal communication differently than how this research has traditionally been done?
Yeah. What AI does is that it lets you understand patterns at new scales and at new levels of precision. So when AI learns about one form of communication, it actually learns about another one. So I'll give you an example from human language. When AI learns to speak Russian and German and Japanese, somehow it's much easier for it to learn Chinese. And why is that? Well, it's because human languages all share a kind of pattern. We all have verbs and nouns, although they happen in different orders. And although we have different ways of seeing the world, we all break things down into small units of speech, words and phonemes and things like that. When it comes to animal communication, it turns out that by working on the entire tree of life, because we work with belugas and we work with orcas, as well as elephants, as well as tool-using crows, as well as jumping spiders, there is something that each communication system that transfers to other communication systems. And that's not something that scientists were able to do before. So you can now start asking questions that were impossible to ask before across the entire tree of life.
Like what? Will you give me an example of a question you might ask of that data set?
Sure. One example might be compositionality. How many species have compositionality? So what is compositionality? So human language has this very interesting thing where we have multiple words and we can combine those words in almost infinite numbers of ways to make new meanings. You have holly, you have day, you put them together, holiday, that's a new concept. It's an open question to what degree animals have that. And generally, the way science happens is that you work with one species, you try to get really deep with them. But if you really want to understand animal communication, you want to look at how compositionality emerged across the tree of life, when it emerged in evolution, learning something about how groundhogs or prairie hogs do communication. And it does look like they have various kinds of words to describe abstract concepts like green, red, fat, thin. How does learning a little bit about prairie dogs tell you something about dolphins that's never happened before? So those are the kinds of things. We can also ask questions about, are there abstract concepts in animal language? We can actually figure out whether there are abstract concepts before we even learn what anything means. It's sort of an interesting effect of the way that technology works. And so that's what we mean by being able to ask kinds of questions that we could never ask before at scales we could never ask them before.
I'm curious, like AI has proven so good so quickly at understanding and decoding and being able to use human language. Do you imagine that animal language is going to be harder? And why is that, if that's the case?
Well, there are two things. So one, there's just a lot more data. There's an internet's worth of data on humans, and that's the fuel that powers AI. And so that's why a lot of the tools that we're building, we're working on this large foundation model called NatureLM, and a lot of what it's doing is starting to unlock all of the existing data that's out there that might be messy, or there are multiple animals speaking at once, and turn it into a format that we can ingest and use. The second reason why working with humans is much easier is because we sort of know what the words mean.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can see what an AI outputs, and we can tell whether it's right or wrong. We don't know whether that's the case with animal communication. And so it's sort of an unknown, and that makes it a much more interesting, much more technical challenge.
Yeah, that was a question for me. Like, once you have sort of an idea of what you think animals are saying based on the output of the AI, how can you fact check that?
Well, one of the ways is by doing very selective playback experiments. It's done a lot in the biology community. A lot of the studies on names for understanding which animals have names come from, you essentially, you figure out, oh, I think this sound is a specific animal's name. You play it back and you see whether that animal looks or see how the other animals behave. And so similar here is that as we start to get very educated hypotheses, then we can start to play back specific sounds or actually have a generative AI in a loop in conversation. But we have to be very careful because, humpback whale, their songs go viral. So I don't know how many people know this, but like the Australian humpbacks are sort of the K-pop singers of the humpback world. And their songs, because they migrate halfway across the world, they'll be picked up by much of the world population if they're popular within a season or two. And so you can imagine if we're not careful and we just start going out and putting a synthetic whale into the ocean that starts to sing, that it might create a viral meme. It might create some sort of like horrible conspiracy theory amongst the whales. And we have to be really careful about what it means to have an asymmetric ability to communicate. This is why we are so strongly about learning to understand versus trying to speak.
I also wonder, to your point, though, are there other potential risks here? Like, I can imagine just knowing how humans are, like, we learn how to tell animals to leave a certain area so that we can develop it. Like, are there other risks that people might take advantage of this knowledge?
Yeah, I'm really glad you bring this up. We think a lot about this and our role as like one of the frontier orgs here. What is our responsibility for first naming what those harms are going to be and then trying to coordinate so that we can block those harms? And so just to name a couple other ones, poachers could use this to attract animals. Ecotourists could use it to like bring animals in. As you sort of named, there's a famous case with Katie Payne, who's an amazing animal researcher who actually first discovered that elephants communicate infrasonically, that is below the level of human hearing. They actually can communicate via their feet through the ground and send messages sometimes kilometers away. It's truly amazing.
Wow.
And she played early on the sound of a matriarch that had died back to the elephant's herd. And all the elephants came running over, super excited, only to discover that she wasn't there. And they were in grief for a couple of days. They just heard their grandmother's voice. And so we do have to be very, very careful. And so we sort of split our responsibility into two. There's what we do, and a lot of what we do, we can control directly. And that's things like we don't do playback experiments with cultural species in the wild. We're very careful about what kinds of data are collected and how. And we work with biologists to make sure like the highest level of ethics are upheld. We try to use non-invasive ways of gathering data. So those are the easy ones. The harder ones are as the technology rolls out into the world and there is a set of market and competitive dynamics that pick up your technology and start to use it in ways that you do not like, say poachers for bad use. And there we think it's part of our responsibility as sort of developers of the technology to first name these harms before they happen, and then start to coordinate. What are the international norms and laws and treaties that need to be in place before the technology is out and easily used by everyone? And it also means we take a lot of care in thinking about which things we open source and which things we don't, in which order, so we can make sure that it's really the good actors that have the advantage.
Yeah. Are there certain species that we're closer to decoding or translating than others? It sounds like maybe yes.
I mean, yes. The answer is yes, and it really depends on like how much data and which biologists we're working with. We're very excited about the Orca project. We're very excited about crows. We started to map Hawaiian ravens that unfortunately have gone extinct in the wild, but we're mapping two different cultures in hopes that we can help researchers re-release them out with their full culture intact. And belugas, like those, I think are the ones we're very excited about. But then some of the great apes, but we're sort of starting to dive into those projects now.
As you're doing this research, and so much of it requires this sort of like ability to do deep listening, does the world around us getting louder make that harder? Like as we develop, cell phone tower technology that's noisy and cars and all of these different things that make the world louder, does that make this work harder?
Well, what I think it makes is for a real urgency of time. Like we are losing the other cultures of Earth. We know that whales change their register in which they speak based on ocean noise. And there's pretty famously now on pretty much every continent, there are whale strandings. And this is where groups of whales, sometimes 40, 60, 100 of them will start acting very strange and then strand themselves on the beach, effectively killing themselves. And we know around half the time this happens after a loud human-generated sound source. And just imagine you're a really social creature. And part of your identity is to be in the communal. We know, for instance, that dolphins, when they're separated from their pod, they will just say their name again and again and again and again until they're reconnected with their pod. And then they'll sort of like resume normal communication. So let's just imagine if your identity is fundamentally social, and if you can't hear anymore, maybe that's why there are these mass strandings, because it's just you aren't yourself anymore. And I'll just say this: for humans, for all of their brilliance and intelligence and intellect, there is still one problem we have never figured out. And that's how can we continue to play the infinite game on a finite planet with exponential power? Like we are not doing a good job at that.
Yeah.
But we do have an example of something that is good at that, and that's nature. Those are ecosystems. And I think there's an imperative for us to learn from ecosystems, have AI learn to think in the style of ecosystems using animal communication as the window for how to do that hardest thing, which is to survive ourselves as our power grows exponentially strong.
What is the end goal? How do you think about what the end goal of your research is?
Yeah. In the end, we think the science is amazing and it's fascinating and it's going to teach us things we didn't know existed. The end goal, though, I think is not really the science. It's the cultural impact. I think where we are with the tools it's almost like that moment in 1995 when astronomers pointed the Hubble telescope at an empty patch in sky. And what they discovered was, of course, not nothing. They discovered the most number of galaxies that humanity had ever seen in one spot. And that changed how we viewed our spot in the universe. And that's our real goal here, is to reconnect humanity with the rest of nature, because almost all of our problems, I think, can be traced back to a form of disconnection from ourselves, from each other, from our systems, from the natural world. And the last time that humanity really got to hear in vivid detail the culture of another species, the voices, that was Songs of the Humpback Whale. And that album, first created by Roger and Katie Payne, went multi-platinum, is on Voyager 1. It's the first thing after the Human Greetings, played in front of the UN General Assembly. It caused the ban of deep-sea whaling, which is how we have minke and humpback whales today. There are these moments when we get a shift in perspective as humanity that doesn't just change us individually, but changes us systemically. And that fundamentally is what we're after.
Yeah, that like kind of makes me emotional hearing you talk about it, because it feels really hopeful and very cool. I'm curious how you try to connect more with nature in your own daily life. Like, has this work changed how you think about engaging with the natural world and with the animals around you?
Yeah. Yeah. It's meant that I spend a lot more time in nature. For anyone that can do this, I really recommend getting on a whale watching boat, but not in the afternoon, but starting at dawn or pre-dawn, because there is something incredible about being surrounded by humpbacks as they come up and breathe. They sound sort of like Darth Vader doing yoga. It's hard to describe, but this deep, meditative, like, and just to be in that kind of slow presence for animals that, some whales live hundreds of years that were here before really the Industrial Revolution got started. Like that form of connecting and slowing down, I think can permeate our being. It changes the come from what we do, and that changes subtly everything that we do. So the short answer is yes.
I love that. Are there other tools, like tech tools, that people can use right now to feel closer to animals, understand animals? I know there are these apps floating around that are like, understand your dog, understand your cat. Like, what do you make of those?
I think a lot of the apps out there right now are sort of taking advantage a little bit of like people's desire to connect. I don't really think, as far as I can tell, they're doing real science, so beware.
Yeah.
But I do recommend checking out like Merlin, which is a great app for when you're out in the wild and you want to understand what birds are around. And you can just open it up, hit record, you're doing citizen science, and it gives you a richer, deeper understanding of the complexity of what's going on around you. And I think there's going to be more that comes out that comes out soon in terms of like that deep ecological understanding, because when we know what's happening around us, somehow we're more connected with it.
Asa, thank you so much. I just really it so often feels like technology pulls us away from our natural environment. And so I love this idea that the work that you're doing is using the power of technology to bring us all closer and to become more connected to the natural world. It's so interesting. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Claire.